Welcome to today's Heatherfield Heritage video, and today we're going to be rather topical. The Bridgewater Canal is our home canal, and as you may have already seen on the news, in the early hours of New Year's Day it breached rather spectacularly at Little Bollington. In this video we'll take a little look at how the canal was put together, what happens during a breach, and what happens after. So let's start with the basics. What is a breach? Canals are man-made structures, and they were all built a very long time ago in very different times. It's completely natural for weak points to develop in a structure that holds thousands of tons of water. Water is not our friend, and it pushes these weak points until it can make its way out of the canal structure entirely, creating a leak. Now, a leak can stay a leak for a very long time, sometimes collapsing the canal wall in on itself and filling in the leak. But sometimes conditions are right that it keeps going until the wall collapses entirely and the water comes pouring out, washing away more of the canal structure as it goes. Of course, this is a simplified version. Structures that run under the canal, like culverts, can collapse. The canal can flood over the top of its banks and wash itself away. There are plenty of reasons why a breach can happen. The Bridgewater Canal is one of the oldest canals, built in the 1760s under the watchful eye of John Gilbert, Thomas Morris and James Brindley, as well as Francis Egerton himself. The section that's breached this year is on an embankment over the River Bollin, and it's been one of the Bridgewater's weakest points right from the very start. The canal is a contour canal, meaning that it follows the contours of the land on one level rather than having locks to raise or lower it, and the Dunham stage of the construction would require a full complement of skills to successfully cross a river, a valley, two roads and the Stamfords' back garden. The Stamfords were supporters of the canal, and Lord Stamford a good friend of the Duke, but there was still a quiet request to keep the canal aesthetically pleasing, which is one of the reasons why it lies as it does where it passes by the White Oaks obelisk. Brindley's expense sheet shows he was in Dunham checking the route in November 1761, charging the Duke for 2 dinners he and an unspecified assistant had while they were there, but it was another 4 years before the first purchase of land in Bollington was made. We can be fairly confident when this purchase was made they were on site and working hard, as the expense book now shows payments made to local farmers for trespass and damage to their land as the canal came through. Constructing the canal had not been without its damages and disasters thus far. The Barton Aqueduct nearly collapsed when it was flooded with water during a test, and the Stretford Aqueduct was washed away during a winter flood. An embankment on the line into Manchester had breached with such force that a workman sent out to retrieve a washed-away wheelbarrow was given half a day's wages for his trouble, and the cut at Trafford Moss kept sinking. But this trial and error meant that by the time the team reached the Dunham section, they were beginning to feel rather confident about their methods. Having decided what line to take across the Bollin Valley, work began on a mighty embankment to raise the land up to canal height. Embankment construction was fairly simple in principle, with multiple layers of earth put into position and compacted down hard. This is a very rough illustration, but you get the idea. It was apparently long believed that there was quicksand in the valley the embankment was to be constructed in, and there may be some truth in that by the notes in the accounts. There certainly seems to have been something unusual in the vicinity, as a steam pumping engine named Sawney was brought in to help. The workmen themselves were immensely superstitious, which caused friction with Brindley at times, especially when one foreman would use astrology to dictate what day to begin large or dangerous work, and refuse unless it was appropriately lucky. Although his son did later note with pride that none of his work ever gave way, so perhaps he was onto something after all. While some of the team raised the ground, masons got to work on the aqueduct that would carry the canal over the river herself. So far no contemporary images of the River Bollin aqueduct survive, so it's difficult to know the details of it. This photo from 1971 appears to show that it's been heavily rebuilt, and we don't know why it's so low, as the Bollin burst her banks regularly then as well as now. It's possible that what we see here is due to silting of the riverbed, as 200 years ago there was a lot of effort spent dredging and ditching around the Dunham estate. It hadn't been in water for very long when it suffered its first breach, although it's difficult to establish exactly where. Almost the entirety of the Dunham section quickly became classed as a problem while the surrounding land settled. Earl Stamford allegedly refused to use the underbridges unless he really had to, and when he couldn't avoid it he would do so at a run. The expense records show that there was still a considerable amount of work being done in the area long after it was completed, but it's not clear whether this attention was to honour the agreement with the Stamfords, who by now had built a boathouse and a small wharf, or because bits of it kept falling down. We're going to fast forward now through the centuries. The entire canal, like canals across the country, had leaks and breaches in varying degrees of severity. The Dunham stretch was no exception, and at one point a resident engineer flatly stated that boats shouldn't stop within a mile either side of the Bollin because it was too unstable, while the idiosyncratic superintendent of the Bridgewater trustees used it as one of his excuses to refuse steam-powered boats. Of course, with its proximity to the Chester Road and the growing need for mechanisation, no one paid any heed to either concern, and the warnings were all but forgotten by the time pleasure boats came on the scene. In 1971, when commercial traffic was almost finished and leisure boating starting to take over, a weak spot appeared in the embankment. How long it was there for beforehand no one knows, but on the 2nd of August the water pushed hard enough at it that it got through and started streaming onto the fields below. 2 young boys noticed and ran to the nearest phone and called the police, who rang the canal company, but the increasing force of the water was tearing the embankment apart. It only took around half an hour for stop planks to be dropped in at Agden and Dunham Town Bridge to prevent all 40 miles of canal from pouring into the valley below, but by the time they did their job, a crater some 90 feet wide and nearly 40 feet deep was left behind. This was probably the biggest breach that the Bridgewater had ever had, and the canal company faced a stark decision. Did they fix it or abandon it altogether? Financially, it made little sense for them to repair it. There was precious little commercial traffic left at all, and pleasure boating was still a relatively new concept, so they had no guarantee it would make money in the future. This logical train of thought was met with anger. With canals across the country fighting to be saved and restored, boaters and fishermen rallied to save the Bridgewater, and the Cheshire County Council mustered local authorities to wade in too. The following year, the Inland Waterways Association held their annual rally at Lymm Village, with hundreds of boats descending onto the village to raise awareness of the Bridgewater plight and bringing people in their thousands down to the water and onto their side. Faced with this potential of a lynch mob, the canal company agreed to repair the breach and join a new Bridgewater Trust made up of all the local council authorities to protect the future interests of the canal, and work actually began. Considering the devastation, it only took about 8 months to rebuild, and it was finally opened on the 24th of September 1973, with balloons being released and a fanfare of hooters from the fleets of boats squabbling to be the first across. So what's happened this time? New Year's Eve saw the region battered by rain, with thousands of gallons of water pouring into the Bridgewater via the Medlock at Manchester, and from fields the length of the canal, and from the Skye itself. Normally the Bridgewater can be drained into the Manchester Ship Canal and out into the Mersey, but both of these were flooded too. With so much extra water, it's not really a surprise it managed to find a weak spot to break through. At about 6:30 in the morning, the water found its escape and, just like last time, the hole got bigger the longer the water roared out. The priority for everyone is to first try and free the boats stranded in the dewatered section of the canal by building a cofferdam at a suitable point and refilling that section of canal. But at the time of making this video, snow and rain have been pelting us for 3 days, and the embankment is still moving and settling. Until this stops, no one can do much at all. There is at least no express intention of closing the canal this time. The canal is too vital to too many people, as a home, a business, and as a pleasure in this hectic world of ours. It's likely to take a year or so, but the canal will almost certainly open again. Thank you for joining me on this little video about our canal. If you've enjoyed it and would like to hear more, click the subscribe button so you don't miss out on any of our new films. You can also buy us a brew on coffee and help keep Heatherfield Heritage fueled while they rebuild our canal. See you next time!